played the Chrysler piece for us. So a warm good evening to everybody. Welcome to this exquisite violin soiree celebrating the legendary Stradivari. Tonight we're honored to have with us three distinguished names whose passion for music and expertise in the world of violins are truly remarkable. Firstly, please join me in welcoming J.A. and Beer, the finest international violin dealership headquartered in London. They're represented tonight by Maya Venjanovska, Director, Head of International Sales, and Robert Brewer-Young, Head of Scientific Research and Conservation. Robert also stands among the world's most active and respected violin makers, and we will have the honor of hearing him speak about the Stradivari tonight. To round us this stellar cast, we're extremely excited to have Hannah Tam, violinist extraordinaire, with the most promising future, who will delight us with her exceptional flair yet again as she demonstrates her craft through the legacy instrument. Together, they embody the essence of musical excellence, and tonight we're exceptionally privileged to hear from their expertise and witness their talents as they transport us into the world of enchanting melodies and unparalleled artistry of Stradivari's masterpieces. Shall we? Let the storyteller begin.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. And once again, it's a very great honor to be here and have the opportunity to share the artistry and the craft of Stradivari as we proceed with an exploration of his unique aspects. I wrote here as an artist, an engineer, and an entrepreneur. I did have the honor and great fortune to work with some of the children here earlier today, and it was a very inspiring experience. What was thrilling was the number of questions that came up. And immediately when I walked in the room, hands were in the air, and the level of engagement was truly fantastic. So it was a real joy to have the possibility of working with some of your children today to explore their questions and actually to get their hands on the parts of an instrument, to hold and listen to the wood, to use some of the tools, and to interact with the materials in a way. I was asked by one of the adult members of the audience that not be limited just to the children. So I want to make sure that this evening we also have the opportunity to hold some of the pieces that go into making a violin at the same time that we're getting to listen to them. We got to hear just now the Macmillan Stradivari from 1721. It's a truly extraordinary example of his work. And quite often when we listen to an instrument, we go deep into its history to imagine who it was played by 100 years ago or 200 years ago. This instrument has a legacy that we don't need to go nearly so far back in time to discover the glory that's been brought to life on the concert stage with this instrument. Ning Feng has been playing this instrument for a number of years previously. It was in his hands. It lit up stages around the world with his artistry, and before that it was actually used by Ray Chen to win the Queen Elizabeth competition. And what's been magnificent for me is to get to hear a new generation of artists represented by Hannah Tam, who is truly extraordinary to work with. Since I arrived in Hong Kong, I've put God knows how many violins into her hand, and her ability to adapt to them in microseconds or in minutes and be able to perform on them shortly after has been really humbling to witness, and also very inspiring as a violin mechanic. I'm ultimately there to serve the art of the musician's music and to make the instruments work their best in order to express their voice. But what I thought is actually we could reach into the box of tricks that we prepared for the children earlier, because I wanted you to get a sense of the materials that an instrument is made of. Because not only is it a historical tradition, it's also a living one. And in the museum now, the Liangyi Museum, we do have an exhibition where we're finishing a violin on site that will be finished on Saturday and heard for the first time here in Hong Kong. But one of the things that I have here is a scroll, and it's something that you see at the top of the instrument, but it's very different to just look at it than to hold it in your hands. So I thought I would pass it to you, and you can pass it around and get a sense of it in your hands. And you asked brilliant questions earlier, by the way. It will be very, very hard to beat the level of questioning that was asked by the children, but I will give you the opportunity to try in a while. So one of the things that comes up as a conservator when I'm working on instruments and thinking about them is the role of the artist, the original artist, in this case of Stradivari. What were his secrets? What were his methods? How was he approaching the culture of music at his time? And how is he responding to both the visual and acoustic elements that he was seeking for in an instrument? One of the deep interests that I have, and that you see very present in this instrument, is color. And color tells a story. It tells a fascinating story. And what we see in this particular instrument is an explosion of the color red. Stradivari began to use a very particular pigment that has a very unique history that actually connects the making in Italy to this part of the world. Because one of the colors that was most highly prized in Italy during Stradivari's lifetime was cinnabar. This first made its appearance in Italy with Marco Polo, who brought the pigment from this part of the world along the Silk Road. So what we see in Stradivari's varnish is a color that appears also on the Banyan Buddhas and in other sculptures from this part of the world. It was very highly prized in Buddhist sculpture as a wash on the robe. And the idea that this traveled along the Silk Road, made its way to Venice, and ended up in Stradivari's varnish, I find a very beautiful link between different parts of the world, different cultures, but appearing in the nature of a color. One thing that's extraordinary about it is it did also talk about Stradivari as an entrepreneur. This color was extremely difficult to access. It was more expensive by weight than gold at the time that he was making. And it was very, very difficult to acquire, but he managed to have access to a very pure pigment that we find in his instruments. And for me as a conservator, this is particularly interesting. But I also think of Stradivari very much as an engineer. And he was someone who was working with, of course, the greatest musicians of his day, responding to the demands of composers, and having to create a new kind of instrument for music that was being composed by people like Vivaldi. Vivaldi was pushing the bounds of what was possible with the instrument, and Stradivari was responding by making instruments with a new kind of a voice, a new power, a new sense of projection. And what's fascinating to see is that the structure that he created, the engineering that he did, has existed for 300 years with very little change. We're still trying to strive to achieve that degree of excellence in engineering. I also speak of him as an entrepreneur, because not only was he an exquisite craftsman, he was also in touch with the royal families of his day. He was very much in contact with the church. He was seeking out commissions from the greatest families like the Medicis, who were supporting a culture of music, a culture of arts, of patronage that continues today, and making possible the creation of an entire new diorama of possibility in music. And Stradivari was an active part of that. And so for me, it's quite fascinating to think of him not as an isolated romantic craftsman alone in his attic in Cremona, but actually in conversation and in a larger cultural conversation that included families like the Medicis and royal families in other parts of Europe. So those are a few of the things that I think about when I look at his work. And I thought we could actually hear a little bit more music on one of his violins, if you're willing to play another piece. And I'm also very keen to have Hannah talk a little bit about her experience of encountering Stradivari's work on a number of instruments this week. In the meantime, I wanted to ask if there were any questions that came up, and you might have another question that you might like to ask, because you had a number this morning, and I don't think you got to finish. If something comes to you, we'll make space for it. But I will invite Hannah to play another piece, and also maybe ask you to compose a few questions that I will try to respond to afterwards.
Okay, so the next piece I will be playing is the Red Violin Caprice by John Corigliano. It's written in conjunction to a movie called The Red Violin, and it's actually the movie is about a violin that was made in Cremona at the time, so it's very suitable for this event. And then I'll play first, and then I'll talk about my experience with the violins. played on is a 1721 Macmillan. I've tried on a few strats from theirs, and being a musician, being a young musician or a musician myself, it's been so nice trying these such prestigious and antique instruments. From what you can see from the piece that I just played, it's very reactive and vibrant, and I'm a little out of breath, sorry. It's very reactive to every nuance I try to make, and it's just a gorgeous instrument and so much history to it. But it's been very, very nice playing on this violin, yeah. And I just got it this morning, and it's super nice easy to adapt and very nice to adjust to it, yeah.
I do have to say, to Hannah's credit as well, the ability to adapt to an instrument like that in that period of time is remarkably rare. And it says a lot about your artistry. And I'm very interested in the language that is used to describe sound. And in searching for a way to describe and explore sound, we have a conversation and we explore things in order to get the best out of an instrument, to find the right string, to make a small adjustment. And when we were speaking yesterday, I asked about differences between instruments, and Hannah described one as very personal, very refined, and very fiery and reactive. And another of the Stradivaris you described, which I found very beautiful, you described as celestial. And celestial is the exact same word that Yehudi Menuhin used to describe his Stradivari. And I find that very beautiful to think of this idea. People often ask, what's the difference between the sound of a Stradivari and that by his notable contemporary, Guarneri del Gesù? And Yehudi Menuhin said that his Stradivari always sounded celestial, sounded like the sky, and it brought light into his world. And the del Gesù for him always sounded and felt like the earth. And I also thought it was appropriate you use that word because Hannah also shared with us the fact that she's an astronomical photographer and shared some magnificent images of the moon and of the planets. But it's an interesting way to also think about the landscape of sound, that it's not earthbound. It's something that actually calls us to look beyond the earth and look at the sky. And at the same time, other makers in Italy are having this very grounded sense of a bass sound that's coming up from below. And I think that those two movements in music are particularly interesting. And hearing the way that instrumentalists begin to describe them as they interact with the instruments, for me is fascinating. But it also has a very technical aspect because we need to listen into sound together. And your voice may require something that I, as one who services these instruments, may be able to augment by balancing things in a certain ways. Sometimes that's just a question of changing a string. Sometimes it's a little bit more complicated intervention. But it's a fascinating dialogue. And it's a dialogue between a musician, a maker, between a maker and history, between that history and the music of the time. And all of that exchange becomes alive in a room like this when we have the opportunity to listen together. I have to say, being in a setting like this and in listening to music, I find personally fantastic. It's less formal. We're not in a concert hall. We have the opportunity to have a conversation. And in a way, I feel like I learn more about music by listening with you in places like this than I do in more formal settings. Although those are enlightening as well. And at times it's wonderful to be one-on-one. It's very nice to share something intimate like this with a small group of people. So thank you very much for the opportunity. And I did want to open it up as well because we all have questions about music, about how it relates to life, to craft, etc., and how those come together in the history of a maker like Stradivari. And I will do my best to answer any questions that might have appeared while we were listening together, if anyone has one.
This is a true pleasure to hear you play, so thank you for sharing. The couple times there was a mention of adapting to an instrument, and I'm wondering what that process looks like. Do you pick it up, play a few notes, and you kind of know how the instrument will respond, and you know how to adjust, or you have to play through all the pieces to know how it responds to different parts, and then that's the first part, and the second part is, what does the adaptation itself look like? Is it staying longer on notes, hitting notes harder,
I see.
or...
So that's a really good question. And I'll tell you the process of what happened this morning because I just received this instrument this morning. So what adaptation looks like is you kind of just pick up the violin, play a few notes, kind of see where the sounding point is because even from Stradivari, each instrument that he made has a little alteration to it. Not every instrument is the same. So for this one, and I played on another Strad a few days ago in a concert, and these two have different sounding points to them, different places for the bow to be where the sound makes, where it sounds the best, I would say. And for the second part of the question, I would say bow pressure point a lot. Like between Guadagnini and Stradivarius, obviously today is mostly about Stradivarius, but for Strad, there's a more core approach to it. You can't really force the sound, and there's a very specific sounding point where the sound just kind of clicks right there. But for this instrument, I would say it's really vibrant, especially on the higher strings. Also has a very warm and deep sound on the lower strings, as you can tell. So it was easy for me to adjust to it. Yeah, I'd say.
Sorry, just to carry on that.
Yeah.
So, based on your personal playing style and an instrument's response to that, would you say there is an instrument that is very well suited to you personally?
I think personally, that's also a really good question. I think personally, I've been loaned a Guadagnini 2 years ago. I just returned it a few months ago, but I know how to adjust to a Guadagnini right away. And so the other day I played on a 1754 Guadagnini from Milan. And for that, it just felt like home when I was playing it. It just felt like it was my instrument. So I think I'm leaning towards the Guadagnini side. Obviously, this is also, beautiful. Yeah, but yeah, I would say that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hannah was talking about Guadagnini, who was another very celebrated Italian maker. And he came after Stradivari, worked in a number of different cities, and had different styles in each place. He would move to a new city, start working with patrons and artists there. And in each place he went, his instruments were somewhat different, have a slightly different varnish, a different model, but they were all distinctively the work of Guadagnini. And his instruments have kind of been described as race cars. They're small, powerful, fast, and fun to drive. And when I hear you play a Guadagnini, there is a kind of match that I think is really exciting to see. Someone immediately bring something to life with this kind of speed and vibrancy. So it was fantastic getting to hear you perform on both of them. And then in terms of the consistency of style, Stradivari had a very, very long working life. He was born in 1644. He died in 1737 at 93 years old. He was still working up until the very end. And over that time, he had an extraordinary career. There was an enormous amount of development, but within all of that, you see a certain consistency, a certain curiosity that's perpetual, that is maintained throughout his entire life, and a certain kind of dissatisfied attempt to achieve the greatest that humans could possibly could achieve in terms of sound. And so there's a kind of creative discontent in his work that I see in artists like Picasso, and even in the refinement of veneer. There's a kind of curiosity and a longing for something more. And you see that up to the very end of his life, which is actually for me very inspiring, because this perpetual desire to explore the voice that's potential in a violin, for me is something that's motivating every day when I get up and go to work at the bench.
Sorry.
Yeah, please.
Just based on what you said, would you, if Stradivari were here, do you think that he would say there is a particular instrument that best reflects my life's work? This is like the closest to perfection I've gotten. Or is it like children, like each one has a personality, and so therefore you love them all? Yeah,
for me, I'd say it's probably somewhere in between. At which moment when you're creating something do you feel like you've gotten closer to the desire in that moment? And again, I think of someone like Picasso. Which of Picasso's periods was the best? He was exploring things throughout his entire life. I don't think he would say Guernica was the best thing I ever did. He was actually perpetually looking for something that was a response to the moment. I think in the case of Stradivari, music was also changing. And Vivaldi was actually composing works while Stradivari was alive. And so there were demands being made upon him and upon the instrument that were entirely new. And because of that, he was having to respond with a new form. And so I'm not sure there would be an ideal of perfection, but perhaps the most timely response. And the timely response to the individual for whom the instrument was being made and who happened to potentially be playing a unique style of music. So I think there's probably an element of individual response to a musician, to a composer, and to a period of his own time when music was changing that would probably relate to what he thought might be the best. but I don't think I can truly answer for him. Please.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Robert. I'm wondering, talking about the pursuit of perfection, what advances would you like to see in the field, just from the more craftsman and engineering side? I appreciate we are looking back, but we're also looking forward, right? And there's a lot of like composites coming out.
Yes.
I doubt we can, 3D print a violin yet, but we are having advances in mechanics. Why not on your side?
So my answer to that question is, what would I like to see more of? I would like to see more accessibility. I've seen the power of music to transform the lives of children. I've worked in very intense environments in South America, and I've seen ways in which music can literally change the life of a community. Violence levels go down, the chances of finishing high school go way up if you're playing an instrument, and I've been closely involved in projects like that. The application of technology that you talk about in that environment is very relevant, because I would like to see conservatory quality instruments being made available to children in underserved communities. So to that end, I've been working with both engineers at MIT and the Cambridge Department of Engineering. So while I use a lot of very primitive technology that I can show you a demonstration of, like this drill, I also use very high-tech 3D scanners, and we're doing forms of CNC, computer-navigated cutting machines, in order to create parts so children and underserved communities can create conservatory quality instruments for themselves. So I would like to see greater accessibility, because I've seen the direct impact of music on communities, and technology is making that possible in very new ways. Other interesting applications of technology and development for me that I've been working with someone at MIT on are bamboo and paulonia laminates. Paulonia is a wood that's used in a lot of East Asian instruments like the guqin. It has wonderful sonorous qualities. When combined with bamboo, you get something very similar to the sound and possibility of a soundboard of a violin. So there are interesting applications of technology that serve different purposes than the standard concert hall, but I actually think that they can align quite beautifully in order to make instruments that are truly conservatory quality, that are of much greater access. So on one element, I'm a technophobe and a Luddite, and on another element, I'm very happy to sit in the engineering department at Cambridge and work this out with other nerds. So, yeah, of course. I'd be happy to talk more about that. We have a charity that we run that's actually developing this in quite a high level. But yes?
Thank you both. It was really beautiful. I'd love to hear, there's so much history in each of these instruments, and as a craftsman here, in taking care of these and when there needs to be work on them, what's involved? I know this could take years to actually talk through, but at a high level, what's involved in making sure that they stay in this pristine condition, and how do you strike the balance of not tweaking or working with certain things that are original within the instrument versus working on it?
There's a long-going debate between conservation and restoration. And I think what's been exciting for me at J&A Beers is opening the scientific department and conservation department allowed us to work in the space between the two. We're working very actively with museums. I work at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, also at the Cremona Stradivari Museum. So we're actively incorporating the techniques and approaches of care that are required in a museum, but also serving the needs of musicians who want to play these instruments. So how do we keep something alive, but together with a community of conservators, think about the next 300 years in the life of this instrument? So it's an active and actually very old debate between conservation and restoration, because restoration will require some changes. How do you minimize those? And it's for me, a very vital question that we ask every time we sit down to do any form of intervention. And but what's been interesting for me personally is working in a space between the museum space and the commercial space that serves working musicians and living artists. Because it doesn't do you any good to see an instrument in a museum that's unplayable with no strings on it. And so how do we actually serve the music of our time while imagining the next 300 years in the life of an instrument? So it's an active question. And it's one I have to respond to every single day when I sit down to do a conservation effort on an instrument.
And so is that done as like a panel of experts that come together with a consensus on how you're going to work?
Yeah, we have total nerd fests on this, and we'll actually meet with other conservationists and try to decide at what point is what we're doing now going to be considered barbarism 20 years from now. And with the advances in technology, particularly for conservation, it becomes a very exciting question. And then we're also in the trenches serving working musicians as mechanics. So there's an interesting and I would say quite vital tension between those two groups. But when you put them in dialogue, I think we have a potential for creating a new culture of care that serves music in a way that's vital to our times. So those are some thoughts. Please.
I would like to ask Hannah. So you receive the instrument just in the morning, and different instruments will have different characteristics. For example, maybe some pitch ranges will sound more brilliant. Do you find that there may be some pieces that fits more better with this instrument? For example, you chose two very challenging pieces just now. Did you make any consideration in choosing those pieces for showcasing these instruments?
I think this is a very subjective question, but I will answer to what I think is best for me. Let's say if you ask another musician, they might have a totally different answer, but I'll answer. I think for this particular Strad, it's more of a brilliant, fiery side to it. So I think it's really nice. It has a really nice projection, as you can tell. So with virtuosic pieces, it doesn't take much work to project or play everything that I want to play to the audience. So I would say that's my approach to this particular violin. It's also, in the beginning of the Red Violin Caprice, it has a slow section. Obviously the lower tones, the overtones are very ringing and it just spins, the sound just spins. So I would say that's my personal opinion on this violin.
I wanted to give you the opportunity, as we're about to close now, to just show you the instrument that we're actually making in the Liangyi Museum. One thing you get to do with this violin that you don't get to do with others is to tap on it and actually listen to how it sounds and how it feels. So I would encourage you to pass it around, give it a tap, see how it feels. And this will be heard for the first time in the Liangyi on Saturday. And it's been a great way. That museum I really love because it's dedicated to craft. And I thought it was quite a beautiful thing to be given the opportunity to craft something on site and for it to have its first notes here in Hong Kong. So I will pass this to you, and I would invite you to tap on it like a drum. I was telling the kids this morning about a Latin phrase that was carved onto a tree, and it says, "In death, I will sing sweetly, but in life, I stand silently." And that's a very beautiful phrase. So we were talking about Stradivari and his singing trees. And it was a great opportunity, again, to be able to interact with the children and now get the opportunity to speak to their parents. We're about to run out of time, I'm afraid, but are there any other last questions that I can address before we... Yes, please.
As parents, most of us are parents here. I think it'll be a long way until our kids will be able to play a Strad,
right.
I believe. So what would you share with parents, some facts or something that you enjoyed about Stradivari that you encourage us to share with our children who are, many of them are budding musicians?
Right. It's, for me, one of the things about children playing music that's most exciting is they don't need to do it their entire lives to benefit from it. Studies in neuroplasticity show very clear that playing an instrument, a stringed instrument, for 3 or 4 years and looking for notes in dialogue with others affects the development of the brain in ways that are lifelong. That's for the parents. When reacting and interacting with children, I think it's very interesting, and it's one thing I wanted to give them a sense of, is how something fragile, 1 millimeter thick, can be bent and immediately become stronger, can be contained within other pieces of wood, can bring music and life into it. And so you can have something that has both flexibility and strength. That relates to the way we navigate the world. It relates to the way that we hold an instrument. It's something very, very delicate, but it can last for 300 years. The only thing that requires is our ability to care for it, interact with it, play it, enjoy it, and bring it to life. So for me, when we think about history, when we think about kids and instruments, one thing to know is that the instrument they're playing now could be around 300 years from now and could be played by their great-great-great-great-grandchildren. And it'll be getting better along the way. And so they can contribute to the life of their instrument simply by picking it up and practicing it. So, on that note, I think we're come to a close. Would you like to play one short piece to...
Sure, yeah.
We have time for a little bit more.
Please do feel free to tap on the violin. It's somewhat satisfying. It's something we normally don't get to do. Pretend it's a drum. It's stronger than you think.
So I'm sure you all know who Bach is, composer. So I'll be playing a short movement from his third partita, the Gavotte.
We do have invitations for the museum. If anyone wants to know the address or any more details about it, please feel free to pick one of these up. And again, thank you for your questions and your presence.
What a divine treat, Robert and Hannah. Thank you so much for such a precious experience you have afforded us this evening. And Dalton is so grateful to have shared these special moments with all of the community tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you have enjoyed the evening, and please join me again in giving a big round of applause.